Hello, everyone. It's good to be here with you as part of our online community. As we've been navigating the pandemic, and now, of course, we're um, navigating a time of deep social unrest in response to the death of George Floyd. And I think it's a moment that many of us are looking to become anti-racist, not to say, oh, I'm not racist, it's not a problem for me, but to actually look at our unconscious bias and the ways that it might seep out and unintentionally cause harm to ourselves and others. And I mentioned this because a number of you actually reached out and said, oh, I loved the video from the last session around the three yanas, the three turnings of the wheel, the three vehicles that we can do, which is essentially three attitudes we can take on in terms of how we show up for ourselves and others. And you said, hey, what would then be the three yana perspective for our current situation? And I want to mention that I'm, not necessarily the person that someone should be coming to with, a lot of questions about, how do I unlearn anti-racist things, because I'm doing the work myself. And there are any number of African American Buddhist teachers out there who, I want to augment and amplify their work during this time. Some teachers I admire just off the top of my head is Lama Rod Owens, who's a dear friend, and he's actually writing a book, or I guess the book is about to come out in mid-June, on love and rage, which is sort of a beautiful and timely topic. And he co-wrote a book with another friend and mentor, Angel Kyoto Williams Sensei, and they wrote a book together called Radical Dharma, which is quite good. Ruth King is another teacher who I really admire, who wrote a book called Mindful of Race. Rhonda McGee is another teacher. Galen Ferguson. There are wonderful voices who are Black and brown bodied that we should be listening to at this time. But since you asked me, how do I show up? I'm just going to answer from my perspective of the work that I'm doing from the three yana perspective to try to be, I feel like ally is almost like too passive sometimes, a term. It's like how a supporter, someone who's undoing the systemic structures that keep all of us in pain. I actually remember I was having a conversation with Angel Kyoto Williams Sensei a couple years back, and one thing she mentioned stuck with me, which is that racism is not a Black person problem. Racism is all of our problem. It's particularly a white person problem. And I realized that we are a diverse community, and I apologize for some of my Black and brown bodied friends in our community that I'm going to focus some of our attention today on anti-racist work around people who are white and not Black. And at the same time, we will also do a loving kindness practice together so that we can all be included in offering love to ourselves and to people we know and that are suffering, people that we don't know that are suffering, which is many right now. And of course, even some of those painful points where we say, oh, I don't know about that person. I find that person difficult, and can we also open our heart to them? But I'll just briefly talk about some of the work, because this is a question, again, I'm always here just to answer the questions that you all bring to me, and this happens to be the question of this particular week. So the three yana view of how we can show up. And that first yana, for anyone who didn't watch the video last session, is based in really, sometimes it's called the Hinayana, but as you may know, I don't love that term because Hina means lesser or narrow. It's actually sort of a form of bias itself that we would call it that. But then there's, I prefer the translation foundational vehicle because it's foundation to who we are and foundational to the work that we need to do. And it's the foundational vehicle is based in not causing harm to ourselves and to others. So how do we start at that point of not causing harm to ourselves and others? Part of this is, in terms of a practice that we can do, practicing mindfulness of the breath is really quite profound. It's really sort of a beautiful thing that helps us, get to know ourselves better, but even unearth some of our own unconscious bias. So this is such a beautiful way of just saying, oh, where am I stuck? What are my stuck patterns? Can I get to know myself to the point of seeing myself fully, not just the wonderful and peaceful parts of myself, but all of who we are, the totality of who we are, the good, bad, and the ugly. That's what mindfulness of the breath practice, or shamatha, may be. Shamatha is a Sanskrit term which can be translated as calm abiding or peaceful abiding meditation. The idea that underneath all of this there is peace and calm, but there's also confusion that we often spend a lot of our mental energy on. And can we look and see our way through that confusion, through the practices that we're doing? And one of the traditional analogies in Buddhism is that there's two wings of a bird, practice and study, that we sort of need both in order to fly. So there's practice, but then there's the study element, that we can read books, that help us look at and educate ourselves around our own tendencies to promote, even in subtle ways, racism. So there's newer books. There's things like Me and White Supremacy. There's How to Be an Anti-Racist. There's older books like Sister Outsider. It's funny, my wife recently brought home an old James Baldwin. I was like, I think this is our third copy of the James Baldwin. We just keep being like, oh, this looks beautiful. And then we were like, oh, we own this. We can keep coming back to it. Anyway, this is tangential. Dharma books, like Radical Dharma or Mindful of Race. We want to go through the Buddhist lens. These are all really wonderful ways that we can read to educate ourselves. Of course, these days we don't have to just rely on books. We can listen to things like the 1619 podcast and other podcasts like about race or Pod Save the People. There's all sorts of resources out there. If anyone's like, oh, I need like a resource list, please feel free to reach out to me. You can watch things. You can go on Netflix and watch 13th. Watch the James Baldwin documentary. It's I Am Not Your Negro. You can watch shows like Dear White People. We can follow organizations on social media. We can read articles that help enlighten us. Ultimately, this is not about, by the way, like a sprint to consume, but pacing ourselves in sort of a marathon over the course of our life of really working not just to absorb material, but to like change our lens of how we interact with people. This is where the practice and anti-racism work really come together, that we're constantly tearing back layers of the onion of how can we unearth some of the ways that we hold ourselves in confusion and cause harm to ourselves and others so that we can wake up more fully. We can work with our emotions, of course. During these last several months we've done so much work around being with our emotions, learning where we shut down and where we turn away from ourselves and saying, I don't necessarily have to do that. And we can work with bias even directly through contemplation. Even sitting in silence and asking the questions. Going all the way back to like, what lessons did I learn about race growing up? What was I taught from a young age? Or more current questions of activity like, what can I do to support people of color in my community? Or what do I want to learn more about during this time? So we could actually ask ourselves these questions in full contemplation. And of course, then there's the Mahayana path, Maha being greater vehicle, but it's the path that focuses on emptiness and compassion, opening our hearts and benefiting others. From a practice point of view, I think loving kindness is a really lovely practice that we can do. And we'll do it today. Tonglen practice is lovely. I'm happy to share resources around that for people who may not know much about Tonglen practice. That we're rousing the heart of aspirational bodhicitta. Bodhi being open or awake, citta being heart or mind. The idea that we can actually show up and cultivate a sense of open-heartedness, that we're actually making ourselves vulnerable and tender to the world and the suffering around us. We don't have to shut down. So this is the aspirational side of bodhicitta. We make the aspirations in loving kindness practice, for example, may the family of George Floyd be happy. May they be healthy. May they feel safe. May they be free of fear. May they feel loved. We make this aspiration for our loved ones. We make it for politicians we don't even necessarily agree with, but we make the aspiration. So this, again, is aspirational. And then the other aspect of bodhicitta is action. That ultimately, the more we turn our mind towards cultivating the open and awake heart, the more that naturally starts to lead towards activity that follows. As we know, the mind and the speech and the body are all connected. Whatever starts in the mind is going to come out through the way that we talk about things, the ways that we actually show up and offer ourselves So bodhicitta in action is often talked about through the lens of the 6 paramitas, or 6 transcendental actions. And for people who are not familiar with these, I'm happy to go through them. Someone who did one of my teacher trainings once came up with a beautiful acronym, in case you ever like, what are the 6? And it's gosh darn puppies eating my peanuts, which stands for generosity, discipline, patience, exertion, meditative concentration, and prajna. So gosh darn puppies eating my peanuts, which I imagine is not very good for dogs. But the image has stuck with me, so now I'm offering it to you. So generosity. Let's start there. What can we do in terms of taking action from a sense of open-heartedness? Generosity can look like any number of things for us. We can give money to funds that support causes we believe in. We can be generous with our time, offering our time and our body at protests or other ways that feel in alignment with our own noble heart. I'm not going to be prescriptive here. I'm just saying, what does it mean for us to be generous here? Does it mean to sign petitions and give of our name? Does it mean to call local politicians and have uncomfortable conversations? Does it mean to give our vote? There are many ways to be generous during this time. But what does it mean for you? That's another form of contemplation. We could just ask ourselves, what does it mean for me to be generous at this time? Discipline. This is a hard one. One that I've found myself struggling with a lot lately, particularly living in a more conservative area than I used to. And, it's sort of the discipline here would be that we could be kind and direct in the face of racism. Is one way to think of discipline in this particular context. Nice and kind are 2 different things. I was actually writing about this on my Instagram recently, that it's not like saying a nice thing to someone. It could be certainly helpful to them, like, oh, I love your, outfit, it's so wonderful. And they would say, oh, what a nice compliment, right? That's nice. Kind, coming out of the Buddhist tradition, the way it's often talked about from my teachers is kindness can manifest in a number of ways. Kindness can manifest as a way that, it's basically the overarching umbrella is, are we trying to be of benefit? Are we trying to be of benefit to not just ourselves, but to others, to all beings? That's kindness. So kindness can manifest as being a shoulder for someone to cry on. It can be taking someone who's heartbroken out for a walk so they feel enriched by nature. It can be magnetizing resources to someone who could actually benefit from further education. It could be actually saying, hey, can I talk to you about the thing that you just said? Which has been a lot of, when I say it's hard lately for me, it's a lot of that. It's a lot of stepping outside my comfort zone and saying, hey, enough of this all lives matter thing. Can I explain a little bit why I don't think that's helpful? Why that might actually be harmful? Or, I spent a lot of time yesterday with an old high school friend who's very conservative and was raised in a particular conservative household and particular values. And a lot of the activity and energy that they have been focusing in our conversations with our other high school friends is around the riots and the looting, and sort of just pointing out the prioritizing of that. I've seen this is not a Lodro thing, but just sort of seeing this being bandied around, the idea of like, instead of saying, I'm sorry that a black man was murdered, but we have to stop the looting, could we say, I'm sorry that there's looting, but we have to stop the continuous death of black-bodied people at the hands of police? And even just starting to engage that conversation made both of us so uncomfortable. And I will just say that, along the lines, I really said, listen, he said, I think it seems like you're calling me racist. I said, I am openly calling you racist, and I'm saying I am racist, that this is sort of the water we swim in. We live in a culture that values white supremacy, and because we are swimming in that water, not surprisingly, we have ingested a lot of it. And it's actually up to us to do the work together. And I think when it becomes less of a me versus you and it becomes an us thing, the discipline of showing up and sort of having difficult conversations, it feels a little bit different in my experience. If it's not a you're wrong, I'm right, or I shame you for this or whatever, it's a no, we're in this together. So that's one way that I've been manifesting. Again, I'm just sharing of my own personal experience as I do the work. And, the small ways that I can. So we can say the uncomfortable thing, but we do it with kindness. We do it with the idea that we are trying to be of benefit to ourselves and to others, to all beings. Patience here, gosh darn puppies, patience, is that we could care for our open heart and for the open hearts of those around us, and realize that change after centuries of our country being immersed in racism is going to be long time. It's again not a sprint but a marathon. It's like that we can actually say, I need to take the long view here and be patient as we make change. Doesn't mean that we say, oh, I'll do it later. That's not what I'm saying. We show up to the best of our ability, but we realize, we take the long view that the work we do now will help future generations. We may not always show up in the way that we want it to in a week or a month, and there's major reform or whatever. That'd be wonderful, but that we sort of take the long view and say, I'm going to work for this long term. Another conversation that many of you have been having with me is around hope. It's hard to have hope, I realize. But hope is a long-term proposition. If we think of hope in direct relation to fear, then we're being too short-term with it. For example, I'm going to go for a walk later today. I hope it doesn't rain. It's me saying I'm worried it's going to rain. There's fear that there's going to be rain. That's a short-term and very specific proposition. As opposed to a more open statement of, I hope that we are able to work toward a more equitable society. That's a long-term proposition, and there's stuff that we can do, that we can actually show up for and inspire each other in holding that hope. Hopefully that makes sense. You let me know. But that overall, hope is more based in moving the needle in the right direction, as opposed to saying, I need to have X, Y, and Z outcome right now. That we don't get too attached to one result or just two results or whatever. It's a long-term proposition. That's the idea that I'm trying to get across. Exertion, that we may not always want to turn our attention to caring for others. I get that. That sometimes feels like, oh, can't I just hide out in my cocoon and just sort of not deal with that statement that my racist neighbor said or whatever it is. And there's something about exertion. Sometimes it's referred to as joyous exertion. In the same way, if we exerted ourselves to get to the meditation seat, we know that we would feel good about it after. And here we're saying, oh, I'm exerting myself to show up for the benefit of others. And it actually does feel good if we do it. So it's that sort of just do it approach from Nike, right? That we know that we would actually feel uplifted if we exert ourselves on behalf of others. Meditative concentration. It's a time that I think many of our meditation practices, between the pandemic and the rise in attention around anti-racism, that we feel like, oh, my meditation practice is really being called into play, and that we could hold space for ourselves and for others, being present to the pain of the world, being focused and open, not shutting down. You can also hold space for people of color to offer their pain, or for other colored people to be with their confusion. Sorry, I should say white people. If I'm saying people of color, then and white people to be with their confusion. But that we hold space for the people around us. And of course, we balance all this with that foundational vehicle perspective of taking good care of ourselves. I should always say that we don't burn ourselves out. But there is something about meditative concentration that once we've actually been able to hold our seat, ground ourselves fully, we have more room in our open and awake heart to hold space for all sorts of people. Again, that's the point I'm trying to make. Please excuse me as I say all of the wrong things at times. I'm sorry. But I'm doing the best I can. And then, gosh darn puppies eating my peanuts is prajna. Prajna can be translated super or superior. Jna being knowing or knowledge. And it's often translated as wisdom, but it's the wisdom of it being not about me. The reason these actions are transcendental is because it's not about me and my thing and my lens. It's actually more about, what is reality asking of me? Can we be with reality as it is? So I think we don't have to center ourselves, for example, and make it about me and my thing and, hoping that we get an award or a cookie for being a good ally or something like that. It's more of what is reality demanding of us during this time? How can we show up in a way that feels meaningful in these various paramitas, or transcendental actions? Sorry, I went on quite length about the Mahayana path, but I'll briefly touch on the Vajrayana as well. Vajra being indestructible vehicle or path. And this is hard to articulate because I realize that this is a community of non-Vajrayana practitioners, but the overall view around Vajrayana is that we open to our innate wakefulness, we open to our Buddha nature that we possess, that we all possess, in every moment as much as possible. And when we open, we entertain sacred view. By that I mean we entertain the view that's based in seeing the basic goodness in us and everyone around us possesses. We're innately whole, complete, good as is, and connect with that regularly, on the spot, moment by moment. When our heart breaks, when we read the news, when a family member calls, can we rouse that sense of connection to our own Buddha nature? Openness and expansiveness to it. In it, I should say. We all possess this Buddha nature, this basic goodness, regardless of our race, our job title, our economic status. It's just beginning to open to our innate wakefulness and relax into the present long enough to see the goodness in others, to move to the heart of the matter. So I think at this point I'll pause and I'll offer a loving kindness practice as a second video because I've gone on much longer than I thought I would. Thank you for your patience with me in general. If I have said anything that caused harm, knowingly or unknowingly, I absolutely ask for your forgiveness. And I hope that we can continue to be in community. The Buddhist term Sangha indicates a community that is committed to waking up together and will support one another in waking up. So this is one way that we can do that, by joining in conversation, educating ourselves, opening our hearts to others. And I look forward to doing some loving kindness practice with you as well. Thank you.